A racist police officer brazenly stopped a car late at night and unjustly detained two black men, completely unaware that one of them was a police captain. When the truth came to light, the situation took an unexpected turn, unraveling far more than anyone could have anticipated. What seemed like a minor mistake not only disrupted the lives of those involved, but also exposed deep-seated injustice, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about equality and fairness. Late at night, the quiet streets stretched endlessly under the soft amber glow of streetlights, interrupted only by the occasional hush of distant cars. The stillness enveloped the surroundings like a comforting blanket, creating a serene yet contemplative atmosphere. Inside a sleek car, John Carter, a senior police officer with over 15 years of experience, was driving home. Beside him sat David Miller, his close friend and partner in numerous community projects. The car glided smoothly along the suburban road, filled with the gentle strains of jazz music that provided the perfect backdrop for their conversation. They had just left a meaningful charity event, where they had worked tirelessly to raise funds for underprivileged children in the area. David turned to John, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Did you see the kids' faces? They were genuinely happy. With a few more events like this, I believe we can create something truly impactful." John smiled, his steady hands gripping the steering wheel. "We're not just helping them overcome immediate difficulties," he replied. "We're giving them a chance to build a future. Sometimes a single ray of hope can change someone's entire life." Leaning back in his seat, David gazed out the car window at the small houses passing by, their windows glowing faintly in the dim light. "But you know, John, I think we can do more," he said. "It shouldn't stop at fundraising. We need to scale up, bring in bigger sponsors, and create a broader impact." John nodded, his eyes reflecting determination. "I've been thinking the same. Maybe next time we should collaborate with major corporations or invite influencers to join the cause. We need their platforms to amplify the message." David chuckled, a mix of jest and sincerity in his tone. "You're never satisfied, are you? You've barely finished one thing and you're already planning the next." "We don't have much time, David," John replied, his voice dropping. "Every day that passes is another child without enough to eat, another child not in school. We need to act now." Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by the blare of a police siren from behind. John glanced in the rearview mirror, catching sight of flashing red and blue lights rapidly approaching. A police car was signaling them to pull over. David frowned, clearly caught off guard. "What do they want? We didn't do anything wrong." John calmly pressed the brakes, keeping his composure as he guided the car to the side of the road. His eyes remained fixed on the rearview mirror. "I don't know, but let's follow their instructions. I don't want this to escalate." David glanced at John, then turned to look over his shoulder. An uneasy feeling crept into his chest. Even though he knew they had done nothing wrong, he couldn't shake the tension of being stopped by the police in the middle of the night. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the deserted road, casting an eerie glow over their car. The police vehicle pulled up close behind, silencing its siren but leaving the lights flashing incessantly. The quiet of the night suddenly felt oppressive. John sat still, his eyes on the rearview mirror as two officers emerged from their car. The younger officer, Brian Smith, led the way, his movements deliberate and his expression cold. Behind him followed an older officer, Chris Johnson, whose demeanor was calmer, but whose eyes darted around as if weighing the situation carefully. David cast a sideways glance at John. "Why do you think they stopped us? We didn't do anything wrong." John didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath, trying to remain composed. As a senior officer, he knew all too well that being stopped by the police wasn't always about wrongdoing. Though he didn't want to jump to conclusions, he couldn't ignore the reality that their skin color might complicate the situation. "Stay calm, David," John said in a low, steady voice. "I don't know what they want, but we haven't done anything wrong. Let's follow their instructions and see what happens." David nodded, but the unease in his chest lingered. The officers approached their car. Smith rapped on the driver's side window with two knuckles, the sharp sound cutting through the still night. John rolled the window down, maintaining a composed but cautious expression. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Smith didn't respond immediately. He stared at John, his sharp eyes scrutinizing every move, before curtly demanding, "License and registration." John nodded and reached calmly into the glove compartment to retrieve his documents. "Here are my license and registration. May I ask why we're being stopped?" Smith took the documents, barely glancing at them before shifting his focus to David. "And you?" "ID," he said, coldly. Pierre cleared his throat, puzzled by the young man's question. David frowned, hesitating. "I'm a passenger. I'm not driving. Why would you need my ID?" "Don't question me," Smith snapped. "Hand it over." Reluctantly, David complied, handing over his ID after exchanging a brief, reassuring glance with John. Smith walked back to the police car, where Johnson waited. The two exchanged quiet words, Smith's expression tense, while Johnson appeared more contemplative. "What do you think is going on?" David murmured. John's gaze remained fixed on the rearview mirror. "I don't know, but something feels off. Just stay calm." Moments later, Smith returned with their documents, still in hand. "Step out of the car," he commanded. John frowned. "Officer, we haven't done anything wrong. I have the right to know why you're asking us to step out." "You're acting suspiciously," Smith replied, his tone icy. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Realizing that resistance could escalate the situation, John sighed and gestured for David to comply. Under the flashing lights, the tension in the air grew heavier. As they stood beside their car, a series of events unfolded that neither of them could have anticipated. Events that would challenge their resolve and redefine the meaning of justice. Detective, moments distance away, finally decided to intervene. His expression was firm, his voice steady but commanding. "Brian, that's enough," Johnson said, stepping closer. "You're out of line. We have no grounds for this level of escalation." Smith shot Johnson a sharp glare, his grip tightening on the handcuffs dangling from his hand. "Step aside if you're not willing to back me up," he snapped. "I'm handling this situation the way it needs to be handled." But Johnson didn't back down. He positioned himself between Smith and the detained men, his tone unwavering. "This isn't handling. This is harassment. They've complied with everything, and there's no evidence of wrongdoing. If you proceed, you're crossing a line you won't be able to come back from." For a moment, the tension between the officers was palpable. Smith hesitated, his posture rigid with defiance. Finally, he stepped back, his expression betraying a mix of frustration and resignation. "I don't command any of the family members in this dock," he responded. Johnson turned to John and David, his voice softer but resolute. "I apologize for this, both of you. This should never have happened." Smith, clearly still fuming, walked back toward the police cruiser, his movements sharp and angry. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, though it was clear his authority in the situation had been undercut. John straightened, the weight of the handcuffs biting into his wrists, but his voice was calm and controlled as he addressed Johnson. "You've done the right thing, Officer Johnson, but this situation is far from resolved. This is bigger than just tonight." David nodded, his frustration evident but tempered by the shift in dynamics. "People like him are why trust in the system is broken," he said, nodding toward Smith. "You saw what he did. and you stood by for too long before stepping in." Johnson looked at them both, his expression heavy with remorse. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I should have acted sooner." By now the small crowd of onlookers had grown. Several people had their phones out, recording every moment, their murmurs filling the air with a mix of curiosity and outrage. Among them was the woman who had earlier tried to intervene. She stepped forward cautiously, her phone still in hand. "This isn't just about them," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is about every person who's ever been treated like this without reason. We all saw it." John turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. Despite the humiliation of being handcuffed, he felt a spark of hope. The power of witnesses and their willingness to speak out could be a force for change. Smith returned to the scene, unlocking the handcuffs with an audible click. His face was set in a scowl, but he avoided eye contact with either man. As he freed John and David, he muttered something unintelligible, clearly unwilling to offer any kind of apology. John rubbed his wrists, the marks from the cuffs still visible. He stepped closer to Smith, his tone calm but firm. "You'll hear from me again," he said. "And next time, it won't be on the roadside." Smith's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, retreating to the cruiser. Johnson, however, lingered, his expression conflicted. "I'll support any formal complaints you decide to file," he said quietly. "What happened here tonight was wrong." John nodded, his gaze steady. "Thank you for acknowledging that, but it doesn't erase what just happened." As the police cruiser finally drove away, the crowd began to disperse, though many lingered, murmuring among themselves. Some approached John and David, offering words of support or asking for details about what had happened. The woman with the phone stepped forward once more. "I'm posting this," she said. "People need to see the truth." John gave her a faint smile, though his eyes betrayed his weariness. "Thank you," he said. "The truth is the only thing that can bring change." David sighed deeply, running a hand over his face. "This isn't the end, is it?" he asked, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "No," John replied, his tone resolute. "It's just the beginning." The two men stood on the roadside, the night's events still heavy on their shoulders. But as they looked around at the people who had come to witness, to record, to speak out, a sense of determination began to replace the bitterness of the encounter. Change wasn't just possible, it was necessary, and it was clear they wouldn't be fighting for it alone. Handcuffed hands behind him, his composure unshaken despite the humiliating treatment, Johnson felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had been complicit in letting this happen, whether through silence or passive observation. Now, he realized the gravity of the situation. Johnson stood up straight and took a deep breath. Walking over to Smith, he kept his voice calm but firm. "Brian, we need to stop this, now. John Carter is a captain in the regional police force. You've crossed a line, and if this escalates further, it won't just be them facing consequences. It'll be us." Smith froze for a moment, his confidence faltering as the weight of Johnson's words sank in. He turned toward John and studied him with a scrutinizing look, but John's steady gaze showed no sign of backing down. "So what if he's a captain?" Smith snapped, though his tone lacked its earlier bravado. "He's still subject to the law, just like anyone else." "And he's followed it," Johnson retorted. "This isn't about the law anymore. It's about your bias, and it's about your ego. If you keep pushing this, it's going to backfire." Nearby, David's face flickered with a mix of surprise and hope. For the first time that night, someone in uniform was openly standing against the injustice they were experiencing. Smith clenched his jaw, his face tight with frustration. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, with several phones recording the scene. Whispers and murmurs could be heard among the spectators, their discontent palpable. Realizing the tide was turning against him, Smith reluctantly reached for the keys to the handcuffs. He approached John first, avoiding eye contact as he unlocked the restraints. The clink of the metal echoed in the air, a sound of both relief and bitterness. "You're free to go," Smith muttered, his tone cold and dismissive. John rubbed his wrists, his calm demeanor unbroken. He locked eyes with Smith, his voice even but resolute. "This won't be the last you hear of this. People like you are the reason the system struggles to earn trust. I'll make sure what happened here tonight gets addressed." Smith said nothing, his face a mix of anger and embarrassment. He turned to release David, who glared at him but said nothing as he stepped back beside John. As the two men walked toward their car, the crowd began to disperse. Some onlookers approached John and David to express their support, while others simply nodded in silent solidarity. Chris Johnson stood by the patrol car, watching them leave. He felt a mixture of shame and resolve brewing inside him. This night had opened his eyes to the deeper problems within their ranks, and he knew he couldn't remain a passive observer anymore. John and David got into their car, the silence between them heavy. As they drove away, David finally broke the quiet, his voice filled with determination. "We can't let this slide, John. Not for us and not for anyone else." John nodded, his grip on the steering wheel firm. "We won't. Tonight is just the beginning." The red and blue lights faded into the distance as the two men left the scene, but the fight for justice had only begun. The events of the night would ripple far beyond that roadside, sparking conversations, investigations, and a push for accountability that neither John nor David would let die. Their resolve was unwavering. They would stand not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been subjected to the same injustices, ensuring that the light of truth would outshine the darkness of prejudice. Officers involved, Smith and Johnson, faced mounting scrutiny from their superiors and the public. The police department released a brief statement acknowledging the incident and promising an internal investigation. However, this only fueled the public's demand for accountability and transparency. Inside the precinct, Smith sat alone in a corner of the locker room, his head buried in his hands. He replayed the night's events over and over in his mind. The shame and regret gnawed at him, but deeper still was the unsettling realization that he had become the kind of officer he'd once vowed never to be. Johnson, meanwhile, was in the briefing room, staring blankly at a report he couldn't focus on. His silence during the incident haunted him. For all his training and ideals, he had failed when it mattered most. John and David, on the other hand, were not idle. In the hours after the video went viral, they contacted civil rights organizations and legal advisors to ensure that this incident would lead to real change. John, with his years of experience and understanding of the system, knew exactly how to approach the situation. "This isn't just about us," he said to David as they sat in John's living room, phones buzzing with messages of support. "It's about everyone who's ever been made to feel powerless." David nodded, his resolve matching John's. "We need to take this momentum and turn it into something meaningful. People are listening now. We can't let this fade away." By the next day, John and David held a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, and supporters from various advocacy groups. John stood at the podium, his presence commanding, yet his tone measured. He recounted the events of the night, not as a tale of personal grievance, but as a call to action against systemic issues that needed addressing. "This is not just my story," he began, his voice steady. "This is the story of countless individuals who have been subjected to unjust treatment simply because of the way they look. We cannot continue to allow bias and prejudice to undermine the integrity of our law enforcement." The press conference was broadcast live, reaching millions. John's words struck a chord, resonating with those who had experienced similar injustices and inspiring many to demand change. Advocacy groups quickly mobilized, using the incident as a rallying point for broader reforms. Protests and community meetings sprang up across the country, calling for stronger oversight and accountability in policing. Within the police department, the fallout was immediate. Smith was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, and Johnson volunteered to participate in a series of community forums to address the incident and begin rebuilding trust. The department also announced mandatory retraining for all officers, focusing on implicit bias and community engagement. Despite these steps, John knew the road ahead would be long and arduous. As he and David sat in his office late one evening, poring over documents and discussing their next moves, John glanced at a framed photo on his desk. It was of him as a young recruit, smiling with the idealism of someone who believed he could make a difference. That belief had been tested time and again, but it had never wavered. "We're making progress," David said, breaking the silence. "But there's still so much to do." John nodded, his expression resolute. "One step at a time. This isn't just about changing policies, it's about changing mindsets. And that's going to take more than just us. It's going to take everyone." Outside, the city buzzed with the energy of a movement growing stronger by the day. People of all backgrounds came together, united by a shared determination to create a more just and equitable society. And though John and David had started this fight from a place of pain and humiliation, they now stood at the forefront of a battle for change, their voices amplified by the countless others who refused to remain silent. The police department faced mounting public pressure as news of the incident spread rapidly. During a press conference, a police spokesperson stated, "We are conducting an internal investigation and are committed to addressing any misconduct if it is found." However, the assurances did little to calm public outrage. Protests began to emerge outside police headquarters, with demonstrators holding signs demanding justice and systemic reform. John and David, after taking a day to recover, decided to speak out. In a live interview, John addressed the audience, saying, "This isn't just about me or David. This is about a system that has refused to change for far too long. If this can happen to me, a senior officer, it can happen to anyone." David added, "We won't stop until everyone is treated fairly, no matter who they are." The incident became a powerful symbol of the fight for justice and equality. Social activists, human rights organizations, and ordinary citizens rallied together, demanding tangible changes. Smith and Johnson, the officers involved, faced immense scrutiny. Smith in particular was suspended pending the outcome of the internal investigation. "This will change everything," John told David one evening, as they sat together reflecting on the events. "It won't be easy, but this is our chance to push for what we've always believed in." David nodded, determination shining in his eyes. "They've awakened something bigger than themselves, and we won't stop until we see real change." The department announced the results of the investigation a week later. Smith was to face disciplinary measures, including suspension and mandatory training on implicit bias and racial discrimination. At a formal press conference, the department representative acknowledged, "This incident is not just an individual mistake, but reflects larger systemic issues. It is time for meaningful reform." Meanwhile, John focused on broader change. He organized a community forum titled "Building Trust, Equity, and Fairness in Law Enforcement." The event brought together human rights organizations, activists, and community members to discuss solutions. In his opening speech, John said, "Justice must be guaranteed equally for everyone. My case is just one of thousands of untold stories. Today we come together to find solutions. not just to change a system, but to change the way we treat one another. The forum became a vibrant space for sharing experiences and ideas. Residents spoke of injustices they had faced, while activists presented statistics highlighting systemic bias in law enforcement. An elderly man addressed the crowd, saying, "I've lived through times when we had to fight for basic rights. To see these issues persist today is disheartening. Thank you, Captain Carter, for standing up and giving us a voice." At the forum's conclusion, John unveiled a three-step action plan: regular implicit bias training for officers, public reporting of traffic stop data, and community engagement initiatives to build trust. The plan was met with overwhelming support, and John felt it was a vital first step. As the day wound down, John and David sat at an empty table in the now quiet community center. David, resting his chin on his hand, asked, "Do you think this will lead to real change?" John, contemplative, replied, "I don't know, but if we do nothing, nothing will change. What happened to us won't be the last unless we act." David sighed, uncertainty still lingering. "I don't want this to fade into oblivion. We need to make sure our story lives on so others won't have to go through the same thing." John's expression lit up with an idea. "I'm going to write a book," he declared. "Not just about what happened to us, but my journey in law enforcement. Everything I've seen and experienced. People need to understand that injustice is systemic, and they need to know we can change it." David smiled. "If you're writing a book, I'll handle the rest. I'll visit schools and community centers, talk to kids, and show them they're not defined by society's prejudices." John nodded with admiration. "That's a wonderful idea. Kids need someone like you to inspire them to believe in a better future." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their resolve filling the space. Finally, John said, "I promise I won't let our story be forgotten." David clasped his hand firmly. "And I promise I won't stop until kids grow up in a world where they're not afraid just for being who they are." A wordless vow passed between them. They both knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but they also understood their responsibility, not only to themselves, but to their community and to those who had been silenced for too long. In the weeks that followed, John threw himself into writing his book. He spent countless hours at his computer, pouring his emotions and experiences into every page. This wasn't just his story, it was a rallying cry for change, a call to action for anyone who believed in a better world. Meanwhile, David began organizing talks at schools and community centers. He shared their story with children, listened to their questions, and inspired hope. Through his words, he showed young people that they could become anything they dreamed of, regardless of the biases they might face. They weren't standing up just for themselves anymore. Their fight was for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. And this time, they knew they weren't alone. Their story had become a beacon, a flame of hope for a community yearning for justice and reform. John's book, Justice Without Color, became an instant sensation upon its release. Its raw and emotional narrative not only chronicled his personal journey, but also illuminated the broader societal issues of injustice and systemic bias. It was both a deeply personal memoir and a manifesto for fairness and reform. At the same time, David's outreach efforts gained momentum. His talks at schools and community centers resonated with younger generations, who saw in him a relatable figure of resilience and courage. Together, their efforts became the emblem of a larger movement for an equitable society. Conversations about justice, discrimination, and the role of the community in reshaping law enforcement began to take root across the nation. One chilly evening, as John drove home from a book signing event, he noticed a car skidding on an icy road and crashing into a guardrail. The impact was violent, and smoke began to rise from the vehicle's engine. Without hesitation, John pulled over, switched on his emergency lights and rushed to the scene. Inside the car was a panicked mother trying to console her two crying children in the back seat, while the father in the driver's seat appeared dazed and unresponsive. John knocked on the window, his voice calm but firm. "Stay calm. I'm here to help." With the help of a few other passers-by, John managed to pry the car doors open and get the family out just moments before flames engulfed the engine. When the paramedics and firefighters arrived, the mother turned to John, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what would have happened without you." John smiled gently, his eyes kind but unwavering. "It's what I'm here for. I'm just glad you're safe." News of John's heroic actions spread quickly, touching the hearts of many. For those familiar with the injustices he had endured, it was a powerful reminder that adversity hadn't diminished his sense of duty. When David heard about the incident, he laughed and said, "That's John. He'll never give up his responsibility, no matter what." In a later interview, John reflected on the event. "No matter what I've been through, my mission has always been to protect and help others. It's why I started this work, and it's why I'll never stop." John and David's journey inspired countless individuals. Human rights organizations used their experiences to advocate for reform. Schools invited them to speak, motivating younger generations to stand up for fairness and equality. Most importantly, their story helped reshape how their community understood justice, accountability, and the power of collective action. One afternoon, as they sat in a small cafe in their neighborhood, David looked across the table at John. His eyes sparkled with a mix of gratitude and determination. "You know, John, we've done something big, not just for ourselves, but for so many others." John smiled, his gaze steady and filled with hope. "And there's still so much more to do, David. But now we know we're not alone. We have an entire community standing with us." They sat quietly for a moment, savoring the rare peace. But deep down they both knew their journey wasn't over. Their mission to bring about meaningful change was just beginning, fueled by an unshakable belief in the possibility of a better future. As the day faded into evening, they left the cafe, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Their story was no longer just about their fight against injustice. It had become a testament to hope, resilience, and the power of transformation in an imperfect world. The tale of John and David transcended their personal struggles, becoming a symbol of the relentless pursuit of justice and change. Their story challenges us to look inward and ask ourselves, what can we do to make a difference? The kind of truly noble efforts we need to make almost every day now in the world of. Have you witnessed or experienced something similar? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring content. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. The end.